scripture today comes from the book of Acts, chapter 8, verses 26 to 40. Then an angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Get up and go towards the south, to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a wilderness road." So he got up and went. Now, there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home seated in his chariot. He was reading the prophet Isaiah. Then the Spirit said to Philip, "Go over to this chariot and join it." So Philip ran up to it and heard him reading the prophet Isaiah. He asked, "Do you understand what you are reading?" He replied, "How can I unless someone guides me?" And he invited Philip to get in and sit beside him. Now, the passage of scripture that he was reading was this: "Like a sheep he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb silent before its shearer, so he does not open his mouth. In his humiliation justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth." The eunuch asked Philip, "About whom, may I ask you, does the prophet say this? About himself or someone else?" And then Philip began to speak. And starting with this scripture, he proclaimed to him the good news about Jesus. As they were going along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized?" He commanded the chariot to stop, and both of them, Philip and the eunuch, went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away. The eunuch saw him no more and went on his way rejoicing. But Philip found himself at Azotus, and as he was passing through the region, he proclaimed the good news to all of the towns until he came to Caesarea. This is one of my favorite passages in the Bible. The Ethiopian eunuch is a compelling character. Every time I read this story, I'm grabbed by that character. And I've preached on this passage a lot of times. Every time, though, I read it, I'm struck by how timely it is. And times change, so obviously I read it in different ways, but it speaks to me every time I read it. And one of the things that struck me this year as I was wrestling with this passage was the question of pronouns. I'm about as straight white male as I could be. And I don't think about those things very often, but a couple of times this year I have. I mentioned it a few weeks ago that I'd read a blog where the woman put it up on her blog, "These are the pronouns I use." And that had me thinking about it, and I was struck by that this year reading this passage. The passage refers to the eunuch as he each time. But I'm not sure. Folk these days are coming up with non-binary gender pronouns, ze and here. And sometimes they use they and them and themself as singulars. And that's becoming proper English at this point, to use those words as singulars. But those I can work with sometimes. The other ones, the new ones, ze, here, that I feel uncomfortable with that. But I'm aware enough that I wrestle with those things sometimes. And I read the passage and I wondered what pronoun this eunuch would use when they talk about themselves. I'll use the male. I'm going to go along with the scripture passage here. But as I do that, I want you to know that every time in this sermon that I say he, talking about that eunuch, I'm doing it with discomfort. Because the reality is that the eunuch was not a he. We're talking about a transgendered person here. What else would you call someone who started out male until someone took a knife to them and made them something else? And that's exactly what happened to this person. That was the point, after all, that the eunuch would no longer be a man. Now, it's very possible that this person was castrated before he reached puberty. That was often the case. Maybe they were looking around the court and they saw this little boy who was as bright as he could be, and he was so good with math. He was so good with math. Someone said, that kid would make a great treasurer someday. And they watched a little more, and someone agreed and said, yeah, you're right. And they went to the child's parents and they said, that boy will be a wonderful treasurer one day. And they got out the knife and prepared him for his life in the court. Maybe it happened later than that. That happened sometimes too. And there were other times that it happened for little boys. But maybe it happened later. Maybe he was a young man who had been captured in battle at some point and brought back to the court as a slave. And then someone saw, this guy is really good with math. And so, snip, snip. Often men who worked in the court were castrated, so that as they went around the women of the court, there would never be any questions of paternity. We didn't want any questions about whether or not those kids were the kids of the king. And in the minds of everyone who looked, this person was no longer a man. Never could fulfill what in their society were the expectations of a man, making children. And it played out in the financial realm where the treasury happened. They looked at this person and they thought, if we take away any possibility of progeny, any concerns of leaving resources for someone afterwards, and make them live as high on the hog as they can possibly live, there will be no temptations to steal. After all, they've got everything they could possibly want right now, and there's no one to leave it to later on, so they'll be honest. And that's what happened to this person. Society looked at him as something outside. Some people looked at him with pity. Sometimes they would look at him and assume that he had no say in this, that someone did this to him without any concerns for his desires. Some looked at him and laughed, and they thought, ah, yes, he's not whole any longer. Some simply looked past him as if he was not there at all. After all, once he died, he would be gone. No one would remember him at all. He was not like us, they said. He doesn't fit the normal categories, they said. Well, for whatever reason, the eunuch finds himself on a spiritual quest. Perhaps it's because he's been removed from the typical concerns of family and all of that, and he's good enough with math. It doesn't take that long to do his work in the treasury, and he's got time to think about things, to ask questions about what matters, what is real, what's important, what gives life meaning. And so he begins to search. And I imagine he's told people, bring me the holy books of all of these religions. And there were lots of religions at that time in history. And so they did. After all, he was in charge of the treasury. He could get whatever he wanted. And he found some that really caught his attention. And so he would say, Bring me a Hindu priest. I want to hear what he has to say. Bring me someone from the Jewish temple. I want to learn about that religion. Those two sounded really good, and he had enough power that he could make that happen. And by the time of today's scripture, it seems that he has made a decision. He has read all of these scriptures. He's listened to teachers from some of these various religions, and he has found something in the Jewish faith that has resonated with his heart. He's read about a God who stands with this little nation who are pushed to the edge through all of their hardest times. He's read these stories, and he's heard the prophets and read the prophets, and he's seen here is a God who cares first and foremost about the people who are on the margins. He's read this faith for whom their central story is one of liberation. And he reads this and he hears this and he says, yes, this is for me. This is for me. And then he discovers that as a eunuch, there is a wall that takes him even beyond the margins and over which he cannot climb. He comes to Jerusalem to worship, but there is only so far he can go within the temple. There is only so much that he can experience. And he's still left outside. Now, we're not sure if he had heard about the followers of Jesus before he comes to Jerusalem. Maybe he had, maybe not. But I'm relatively sure that they would have excluded him as well. In large degree, those in the earliest church were poor folk. They were folk who were broken, who did live on the margins, who had been rejected by people with power and prestige, and they would have looked at this eunuch and they would have seen someone who came from the queen's court. Power? He snapped his fingers, and they went all the way to India to bring him a Hindu priest to teach him about Hinduism. Wealth. We see here he's visiting Jerusalem, and most of us, we didn't really think about it too much when I read that passage, but he came in his chariot. Well, ordinary folk didn't have chariots. And when someone had a chariot, they didn't travel by themselves. Because that was like holding up a big flashing neon sign that said, "Rich guy." So, traveling across the desert, traveling through the wilderness, this was the wilderness road, we read there, you had to have an entire entourage. You needed to have soldiers to keep you safe. You needed to have servants. You needed to have a cook to make sure everybody had food. You had to have some people bringing the animals along with them, so you had something to butcher and feed all these people. You had to have a wagon coming along with your provisions. It shouted money. It shouted power. And those early church folk would have looked at all of that, and the first thing they would have seen was gold, silver, fine jewels, all of the trappings of the people in power, and the first thing they would have thought of was, yeah, we know what those people did to Jesus. And they would have kept him at arm's length. But I've said many, many times that the scripture writers tell us the stories they do because they want us to learn something. They wanted their church to learn something. Luke wanted this story in here because it was important. It was not by chance that this happened. God engineers it. The eunuch is going on his journey down this wilderness road, and the Spirit speaks to Philip and says, "Philip, I want you to go over here. There's something that needs to happen along that road. You need to find someone." Philip goes, And he sees this entourage coming, and the Spirit speaks and says, Philip, go over to that chariot. Are you crazy? I'm not going over there. There's people with swords. What are they going to do? No, Philip, that's where you're going to go. But what am I going to talk about with him? He's a eunuch. And he's from Ethiopia, and what am I? Philip, go. And so he goes. And he finds the eunuch riding in the chariot and reading, and the practice was to read out loud. And so he hears what he's reading, and do you understand what you're reading? And the eunuch says, well, how can I understand it? I need someone to explain it to me. And I see Philip jumping up in the chariot and say, okay, let's talk. And off they go. Don't know how long the trip goes. But they come to the point where the eunuch has heard what he needed to hear. He's heard that the Spirit has told him that the walls have come down and he's ready to be baptized. And he sees the water and he says to Philip, what's to keep me from being baptized? He knows what's to keep him from being baptized. Sometime in his history, somebody did snip, snip, and put him beyond the wall. And the Spirit speaks to Philip as well. He says, nope, the wall is gone. And they get down out of the chariot. The eunuch is baptized, and the Spirit snatches Philip away. And he disappears, and the eunuch goes on his way back to his home, rejoicing. Maybe the first Christian in Ethiopia. The Spirit has torn down walls. And the walls continue to come down. I was thinking this week about walls that have come down and about walls that need to come down. And walls that we kind of massage and we're not sure about just yet. These past couple of weeks, I've heard multiple stories about folk in some of our local, more conservative churches who have been disfellowshipped. And it has hurt my heart deeply. Some were disfellowshipped for expressing love to someone. Some were disfellowshipped for expressing doubts about their faith. Some were disfellowshipped because they didn't know how they fit in. And they were told, oh, by the way, you don't. Most of them were disfellowshipped simply for being who they were, without pretense. The Spirit's knocked down all those walls. God doesn't ask us to come without any doubts. God doesn't come to us saying, oh, yes, come and be part of this blessed community. But first you've got to change this and this and this and this and this. God just says, welcome. There are no walls. And we know that here. We know that here. We do that pretty well here. And if someone is watching this on the video, and they are looking for a community with which they can walk and struggle and express doubts and be who they are and try to grow and find purpose and meaning and be part of the blessed community, well, yes, the walls are down. Now, we're doing pretty well with some of them. It's been a long time that this church has wrestled with LGBT questions. All the way back to Howard's book. And it's pretty much a non-issue for us. But T is another question, isn't it? Transgender It's a question that gives most of us some pause because we don't understand it, we don't identify with it. It's just so foreign for us. And Q, even more so. A lot of us wonder even, what in the world does Q mean? I don't know. Folk who experience their gender, their sexuality as something else altogether, who lives a different reality from the one that most of us experience, and it's hard. It's hard. And this story tells us, because it is about a transgendered person, and there's no other way to read it, that the Spirit doesn't require the eunuch be something other than what he is. The Spirit doesn't say, oh, you can't come in because you're one of them. Philip says, oh, there is water. Let's do this. There are other folk that we have issues with. We put up walls for folk with mental illness. We've all known folks with demons, the likes of which haunt our nightmares, people who hear voices, who feel compelled to hurt themselves, who see a world that we can't see. And it's frightening. It's frightening. Sometimes it's frightening to us because it's so foreign. Sometimes it's frightening to us because it's so familiar. And sometimes people with mental illness disrupt things. And we don't like things disrupted. And it's easier to keep folk at an arm's length. And as a society, we haven't figured out how to deal with mental illness. You know, we used to lock people away in institutions and kind of ignore them there. And then we decided we didn't want to pay for that anymore, so we put them out on the street. And now we yell that, oh, there's mental ill people out on the street. What are we going to do about this? And we don't know what to do. And in churches, we have issues. I can't tell you how many times I've been with clergy where there has been a discussion about what do you do when that person comes into your church? And usually it ends with some description of how you get them out. Guess what? And I'm not implying that that's an easy question to deal with. It's a hard thing when you have mental illness in the church. It's hard. But the Spirit says the walls are down. God says, I don't care if you hear voices. I don't care if you see things. Indeed, I care more. And if you feel compelled to hurt yourself, I just want to embrace you and hold you and whisper peace. The Spirit knocks down the walls. We've been thinking about one of our church members who's headed off to prison soon. Been thinking about what happens when she gets out and how hard life is for released prisoners. That when you go looking for a job and you put, where were you the last 10 years I was in prison? How many interviewers go, oh, I'm sorry, that job has been filled. Or, you just don't meet our requirements. And what's the requirement? Well, I'm not sure, but you're not it, whatever it is. And regardless of what brought them to that place, trust is a hard thing to find. And without finding trust, how do they make their way back into community? The Spirit knocks down those walls and says, welcome. Welcome. Sometimes the walls aren't so far afield. Maybe sometimes the walls are walls that we put up inside ourselves. Times when we look at ourselves and we put the walls up because we're afraid if people really knew me, if they really knew what I think, if they really knew what I've done, if they really knew me, they wouldn't like me very much. They wouldn't welcome me. And so we hide. And we keep people at arm's length, and that keeps us from finding true community. And we know this one as well, that the Spirit says, no, those walls need to come down. We need to be authentic with one another. And we can do that because the Spirit says welcome. And we are accepted who we are and as we are. Luke tells us this story, and you know, this would have been a really difficult story throughout the history of the church. Anyone who read this and really took it seriously would have gone, oh, I don't know about the eunuch. That's just not, I'm not feeling comfortable with that one. But Luke says, no, you need to hear this because the Spirit breaks down the walls, especially when you don't feel comfortable. Especially that. And when the question comes from anyone, what walls keep me from becoming part of the beloved community? The Spirit says, none that I can see. And if there are any there, it's only because some churches built them where they're not supposed to be. The Spirit says, welcome, because the walls have come down.